Writer's Read by LiTracey. Getting that book in children's hands.
Hi, I'm Tracey Grice and welcome to the Writer's Read podcast. One of the quotes that inspires me in my practice as a teacher, in fact it's the one that sits front and centre of my desk at school, is written by Nancy Atwell, an internationally acclaimed author, and she says that for students of every ability and background, it's the simple, miraculous act of reading a good book that turns them into readers. Because even for the least experienced, most reluctant reader, it's the one good book that changes everything. The job of adults who care about reading is to move heaven and earth to put that book into a child's hands. And that's why this podcast exists. On this episode of the Writer's Read podcast, I'm talking to Melbourne-based author Emily Gale. As you all know, on the Writer's Read podcast, our reader in residence reads aloud from their latest book, and we have a chat about their life as a reader. Here's a snippet of what's coming up later in this podcast.
And I've always been very fortunate to have been surrounded by books. And that was always my superpower as a child. And it was my only superpower.
Also, on each Writer's Read podcast, we have our Rebecca Recommends segment with children's literature guru, Rebecca Bird. Rebecca will be sharing her insights on other titles written by Emily. Now, we're hearing from Emily Gale. Emily has been involved in the children's book industry for over 20 years. She's worked as an editor for Penguin and Egmont, a freelance manuscript consultant and preschool book writer. She's also worked as a reviewer and been a judge for the Victorian Premier's Literary Awards. Emily's writing includes Eliza Boom's Diary for younger readers and 4 novels for teenagers, Girl Aloud, Still My Sunshine, The Other Side of Summer, and her latest young adult book, I Am Out with Lanterns, and it is from this book that we will hear Emily read from now.
Well, I Am Out with Lanterns has 6 points of view, and the first point of view is Adie, who is coming back to her childhood home in Melbourne after 9 years away. And she's coming back to this house that has been lived in by lots of other people during those years. She's come home with her father and his girlfriend, who she really does not like. On the 5th day, Dad comes home with an easel. We're in the TV room watching Dara's favourite show about midwives in 1950s England. I understand literally nothing about my not-mother. Dad comes in the front door and our heads turn as he carries the easel past us like a stiff body. Just Adie today. Perfect, Dara says, and I leave to the sound of her lighter. But this was inevitable. Sometimes Frank is my father, sometimes not so much, but he is always an artist. The last place we lived in Tassie was an artist colony run by an older woman. I think she was in love with Dad because she bought him whatever he asked for. He only packed the smaller stuff when we left, like paints and brushes. Dad paints me, mainly, and whichever woman is living with us at the time. The whole reason we came back to Melbourne was because Dad has been selected as a finalist in the National Portrait Prize. He's ignoring certain details, there are 45 other finalists, and focusing on others. This is a huge milestone in his career. He's been overlooked for decades. The portrait is of me and Dara. The back garden is overgrown, and the ground rises and falls as if giants are buried there. At the end is a small glass house, Dad's studio. He sets up the large easel, battle-scarred with someone else's paint, patches of algae and tiny cracks. It doesn't look as if anyone has come into the studio the whole time we were away. The cobwebs are legendary, the dust as thick as fur. Dad's in a moth-eaten t-shirt that sags around the neck and clings to his belly. He's unshaven and his beard has come through like morning frost. His skin looks grey, flecked with tiny red capillaries. He doesn't sleep enough and drinks too much. I perch like a sleeping bird, dead still. My head turns to face him, my chin resting on my shoulder. The beginning of a sitting is always the same. I'm conscious of every inch of skin. My mind wants to wander, which makes my body twitch. Dad's head appears from behind the canvas and hides again. He stares. He scowls. He huffs. Is it me or his sketch that makes him angry? Dara's in the garden, stepping around without much purpose, smoking. She appears close by briefly, then goes back to the house through the no-door doorway. Part of me wishes he'd only paint her. The other part likes to piss her off. In the second hour, everything's an ache. The scrape of pencil on paper gets into my veins. I close my eyes. AD, eyes please. Why? You know what they look like. They're his eyes, someone used to say. Someone pre-Dara, maybe even as far back as my mother, but I don't remember her, and Dad says it's for the best. I open them, because when Dad's art goes well, everything goes well. So that's when AD has come back home, and it sets up one of the themes of the book, which is self-image and how artists have used young women in their art, often without thinking about how that might affect the young woman. And that, again, feeds into the other theme, which is how we use Instagram now.
This is such a brilliant book. And by now, you know what you need to do if you want to find out what happens to Adie. You need to get that book in your hands.
Rebecca recommends.
I have to let you know in advance that my chat about both of the books today may be slightly shorter than usual. And that's not a bad thing, I promise. It just so happens that both of the books that I have read have some element to them that I can't talk about, because they're the thing that makes each of these books such a treat to read, the unexpected. I'm happy that Emily chose to read from her new book, I Am Out with Lanterns, because that gives me a chance to talk about The Other Side of Summer. While the book, Out with Lanterns, isn't really a sequel to The Other Side of Summer, it does revisit some of the characters from this one. I really love this book, and I think it's probably because I really love the character of Summer. The story begins in England, where Summer's family are coming to terms with the shocking death of their son and brother. He was killed in a recent bombing. Each family member is dealing with their grief in their own way, but it's Dad who makes the drastic decision that they are all going to move to Australia, where he's from, to get a fresh start. So they move to Melbourne. Well, not all of them, because Summer's mum doesn't move with them. So moving from an English winter to an Australian summer would be difficult enough, but this is a family that are trying to rebuild themselves, and that is hard, because two of the pieces are missing. Their brother Floyd is gone forever, and the other, their mother, is thousands of kilometres away. Adjusting to the heat and the culture shock is one thing. Adjusting to life without Floyd is another. And when Floyd's guitar gets delivered to the house for Summer, she starts to hear his voice in her head. You see, Floyd was always going to teach Summer to play the guitar, but they just never got around to it. But now she is determined to learn with Floyd's help. So even though Floyd is not physically in this book, his presence is still a big part of the story. And then we have the mysterious Gabe. He appears to Summer at the creek when she's playing Floyd's guitar. But that's the only place she sees him, and sometimes she wonders if he's there at all. He is a link to Floyd. He knew him, and it's Floyd's guitar that seems to be the key to the mystery. Figuring out who Gabe is and what his connection was to Floyd plays a big part in how this family begins to heal. I even love the character of B, the dog, and he's essential to the story too. See, Summer is the only one in the family who didn't really find someone straight away. Her dad is all matey with the neighbours, and her sister Wren made instant friends with a boy called Milo, but Summer is mainly figuring things out on her own, so she has the help of Floyd, Gabe and B. See, Emily Gale even writes dog characters really well. I don't think I'm a dog person until I read about dogs like B, and then I really just want one. Now, I'm terrible at putting age recommendations on books. I'll admit that I tend to be quite conservative, erring on the side of caution. So in this book, Summer is 13, and there are some slightly teenagey aspects, but I do think it would be fine for most Year 7s. But as always, it will depend on the maturity of the reader. This next book is my favourite kind of book. It's the kind of book that you start reading and you have no expectation at all, the book that just takes you by surprise because you read it in just a few hours, because you just couldn't put it down. That's how I feel about Still My Sunshine. This is what the blurb has to say. During a Melbourne heatwave, Hannah's family life begins to distort beyond her deepest fears. It's going to take a lot more than a cool change to fix it. But how can a girl who lives in the shadows take on this task alone? Feeling powerless and invisible, Hannah seeks refuge in the two anarchists of her life. Her wild best friend Chloe and her eccentric grandmother Essie, who look like they know how life really works. But Hannah's loyalty to both is tested, first by her attraction to Chloe's older brother, and then by Essie's devastating secret that sheds new light on how the family has lost its way. Even if Hannah doesn't know what to believe in, she'd better start believing in herself. So one of the things that I loved about this book was the feeling that when I was reading it, I was reading an Australian YA novel. It sounds weird when I say it out loud because I read a lot of Australian YA and I love lots of Australian YA. But it's only every now and then that it feels like a story that could only be told here. And I hope that there are people out there listening who get what I mean and they don't just think that I've lost the plot. And because I've had to think about it for this podcast, I may have come up with a reason for this feeling. And I think that in some books, the place where the book is set is just as important as the characters or the plot. So it's the place that evokes emotion and feeling, and it's more than just a setting. So in saying that, this book, again, is set in Melbourne, like The Other Side of Summer. I don't know what it is about books set in Melbourne, but I love them. Maybe it's the city, or maybe it's just the authors from Melbourne know how to paint their city in such an appealing light. This one is mainly set around St Kilda, which again I've got a love for, so it was nice to read about a place where I have fond memories. Even the heatwave plays a big part in the feeling of this story too. It adds a dimension of heaviness and weight to what is happening in the story. I love the character of Hannah's grandma, Essie. She reminds me of my own grandma, who wasn't an alcoholic, I might add, but I did get to spend a lot of time with her, and there's just something about the relationship you have with a grandparent that's very special. Essie is more than a little crazy. When we first meet her, she's basically pretending to be dead in her lounge room, freaking out Chloe. Turns out that she isn't dead. She just thought her neighbours were breaking in, so her plan was to pretend to be dead so that they would leave her alone. She's quite the character, this one. Hannah is feeling very separate from her family. Her parents have split up, her dad has moved out of the house, and now it's just her mum and brother left, and they seem to have formed quite a little unit, keeping Hannah on the outside. It was always her dad she was closest to, and now he's gone. This is really a story about relationships, with family, friends, and a little bit about boys. Over the course of the novel, we see how Hannah's relationships change with everyone in her life. Her dad, mum, brother, Essie, and her best friend Chloe. I like the honesty in the depiction of Hannah and Chloe's friendship. They're very different people, and while having friends who are vastly different to ourselves can be a good thing, there may come a time when these differences get to be too much, and there's less common ground that connects you, you drift apart and move on. We read a lot of books that feature breakups of romantic relationships, but not often do we read about breakups of a friendship. But it's a thing that happens, and when it happens it's hard. Just because you've been friends with someone for a long time and have all of this history, it might not be a forever friendship if that friendship is no longer feeling good. My other favourite thing about this book is the one thing that I can't tell you about, which is Essie's story. I want you to go out and read this book like I did, not really knowing what I was going to get and then being drawn into this remarkable story, opening my eyes to an aspect of our history that I'd never really thought about. My favourite thing about Emily Gale's writing is that her characters feel so real, and as a reader I just feel so connected to them and their stories. Having read The Other Side of Summer, I fell in love with Emily Gale's writing, and I'm happy to say that it wasn't a one-off thing. Her other books give me the same feelings. The stories themselves are good, yes, but for me it's the characters that I fall in love with. They're so believable, and that's what makes these stories memorable to me.
Hi, I'm Emily Gale, and you're listening to the Writers Read podcast.
As I mentioned in my intro, Emily has an extensive and multifaceted background in the literature world. I had the opportunity to spend some time with her while she was in Adelaide, and I loved her warmth, her energy, and the clarity in which she talked about her reading life. And I hope you get as much out of this chat as I did. So this podcast, whilst we heard a read aloud and heard a little bit about you as your writing, we're going to switch focus now to think about your life as a reader, so that our listeners and I think of my students in particular who are building really interesting reading lives for themselves and really trying to find their identity as a reader. And I find that when they talk and listen from adult proficient readers in their life, it helps them to connect and to think about themselves as a reader in ways that can be really helpful to propel them forward as readers. So when you think about your life as a reader, do you think, would you say that books and reading have always been a part of your life, or is it something that's more recent for you?
I can't remember not reading, and I've always been very fortunate to have been surrounded by books, and that was always my superpower as a child, and it was my only superpower. So they've been a huge part of my life, and I have very vivid memories of childhood books. and of how safe I felt when I was reading.
And do you think that, were there people in your life that inspired you to read? Or was it something that you sort of just came to yourself?
It was just the first thing that I was good at. And then I think it stayed the thing that I really felt comfortable with. But I did grow up in a house where everybody read, and including my grandparents. They had a lovely library as well. And I would go and stay with my grandmother most weekends, and she would take me to the bookshop and the chocolate shop. So very, very spoiled with books by my grandmother. Yeah.
So would you say, when you think about all of those books that you were exposed to and read as a young child, was there one that stood out to you for any particular reason?
Can I say two? It's
of
always
course.
so hard to choose.
I know, it's a hard question.
Okay, but they both have Charlotte in the title. So the first book that made me incredibly angry was Charlotte's Web.
Okay.
And I loved Charlotte's Web so much. But when I got to the end, I think it was the first time that I was just furious with an author. And the rage felt as real as any emotion I'd ever felt in my life. It didn't change how much I loved the book, but it really struck me as very powerful. And then a few years later, I read a book called Charlotte Sometimes by Penelope Farmer. And that began a long relationship with time slip novels. So that novel takes place between the 1960s and the First World War. And I just loved the idea of A, slipping back in time, but B, what happens in that one is that she does become another person. And so it's very strong on the theme of identity. And I can remember finishing that book and being devastated that it was over. And so then I think I just never wanted my nose out of a book.
That's really interesting to me because sometimes, I find that same bond with a book and I can't believe it's over. And sometimes it's really hard to pick up another book because I'm still living in the world of the previous book. And in fact, I had a student recently who had a similar experience with that you had with Charlotte's Web. And his 12-year-old reader, avid reader, had tears in his eyes and said, why would the author do this? He was absolutely devastated. But I see that for you, it hasn't impacted your life as a reader, that you've picked up, dusted yourself on and off and kept on reading. What advice would you give to young readers who are feeling that same pain?
Well, I think for a start, if you miss the book you just read, just turn to page 1 and read it again. And I think that that's something my son reminds me of all the time. He's 11 and he makes me feel like books are the biggest bargain thing I could ever buy for him, because he will never read a book just once. He will read it multiple times and really love a book. And I don't think I did that very much as a child, but now I really indulge myself if I want to read a book again. Especially if you read a book quite quickly the first time, I think, why not? Just turn back and do it again. And if that's not what you want to do, then sometimes you do have to open a few books before you find one that you can really settle back into after you've really loved something. So just challenge yourself to read page 1 of this book, and then that book, and then that book, and one of them will stick. And then you'll find yourself in exactly the same position in another 200 pages time.
Just some really great advice there, the power of rereading. And I can think of a whole lot of students who will reread for multiple reasons. Sometimes because they just can't find the next book, but sometimes they just want to relive that whole experience. But also having multiple books on the go. And that's something that's an interesting discussion I have with students about whether they should, whether they shouldn't. What advice would you give to students who, they've got their book box and they might have 3 or 4 novels, and they may be questioned by other adults in their life who say, I can't read 4 novels at a time, choose 1 or 2. Your life as a reader, how does that look for you?
I definitely used to read 1 book at a time as a child. But I don't do that anymore. And I think probably working as a bookseller for a few years taught me the art of having several on the go. But I think that's a discipline that you either have or you haven't, and you definitely shouldn't put up with anyone criticizing you for reading 3 or 4 books. Again, that's something that my son seems to have the skill for naturally, even though it took him a long time to learn to read. Now that he can read fluently, he finds it really enjoyable to pick up at random, turn to the middle of a book he has read 12 times, and just spend an hour in that book and then put it down again, maybe not pick it up again for another couple of weeks. So I think it's a great skill to have. And if the adults in your life don't have that skill yet, well, never mind. Maybe you can teach them.
So as an adult reader, what does reading look like for you now? Obviously, as a child, you grew up, immersed in books and reading, and it was your superpower. Is that the way you still see it today?
I definitely identify first as a reader before I identify as anything else. When I'm writing a YA book, I find it very difficult to read a lot of YA because I just second guess myself too much. So I had a big drought of YA while I was writing I Am Out with Lanterns. So as soon as I had finished and it had gone to the printer, I got a big stack of the YA that I'd been dying to read. And that's all I read for a few weeks. But I do like to vary my reading a lot more as an adult than I did as a child, just a lot more adventurous. And again, I think that comes from working as a bookseller and having to have a very broad knowledge of books. But certainly the main feature in my apartment is a bookshelf with ladders. That was a sort of a lifelong dream. So yeah, anyone who walks into my house knows immediately what I'm all about.
Great. Is that your place where you read? Is that sort of, I'm picturing in my mind books and ladders. Do you have a special chair, a special spot that's... it's the sort of don't disturb me spot while I'm reading?
I very recently bought myself this blue velvet chair, which I had intended to be just my chair for reading, and it's placed directly in front of the bookshelf. Unfortunately, I have 2 cats and a dog who have a slight disagreement over who owns the chair. But when it's mine, it is in the perfect spot to put my feet on the table, coffee table in front, and have a view. And sometimes it's a scary view of all those books that you've collected over your life and not necessarily read all of them. Sometimes you have to wait for the right time for that book to be the right one for your life. Yeah. But I also just feel so calm when I look at those books because I know that that's where real happiness lies, in those pages.
Absolutely. And when you think about that, when you look at those books and you think, oh, I haven't got to you yet, I guess for some children, that I work with, that's an overwhelming feeling, or they think, I've been given this book and I haven't got to it yet. And it's almost seen as a deficiency in some way as a reader. So could you talk to that a little bit more?
I really think that it's all about timing. And I can remember, for example, trying to read Jane Eyre when I was about 14. And I was a very good reader, but Jane Eyre felt hard for me and I just couldn't get into it. And I really criticized myself because I knew this was this amazing classic and everybody loved it. And why didn't I get the joy from this book? So I stopped reading it. And that was a big deal for me because I didn't quit things when I was a child, but I did quit Jane Eyre. And then when I was 19, for some reason, I thought I'm going to try that again. And it was a completely different book. So I really think if you've tried a book and it's not working for you, you shouldn't feel guilty about it. Maybe give it a try further down the line. But if this is reading for pleasure, then that's really should be the top of the list.
Absolutely. So what, advice, my job, my passion, what I absolutely love is finding that book that lights a student up and gets them going as a reader. Have you got some final advice that you could give to students who are listening?
Well, if you can think of the last 3 books that you loved, I bet you will find some common threads in those. Even if they're tenuous, even if you have to think about why you loved that main character. I can remember as a child, I really liked reading about naughty main characters because I felt like I was naturally quite naughty inside, but very good on the outside. So I really loved reading kids who were actually allowed to be naughty. So try to identify what really makes you happy in a book, and then find someone who is going to help you. And that's, your teacher, a librarian, a bookseller, especially if you can go to an independent bookshop where people have just spent their whole lives just waiting for you to walk in the door so they can tell you exactly what you need to read that week. And you will find that book. Maybe you have to read a few first chapters before you find the one for you.
And that's the thing, isn't it? That persistence, that it might not be the first page or first chapter that even gets you in, but just thinking, about just giving it a really red hot go, isn't it?
Yeah. And don't be put off if you like something that not many people like, or if you like something that maybe someone has told you is not serious enough for you to read. Particularly things like graphic novels, I think, that's an excellent skill to have, being able to read a graphic novel. A lot of adults can't read graphic novels. They just can't process the information in the same way that some kids can. So if that's your bag and you find that some adults criticize you, just know that you are on exactly the right track.
Absolutely. It's that reading for joy, reading what makes you happy. And I think that's terrific advice. So thank you for your time, Emily.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Tracey's tip.
One thing that often strikes me when I attend librarian conferences, or even when I'm having chats with the authors on this podcast, is the topic of reading the classics, as we often hear them referred to. Those books that have really stood the test of time. And that to be well read, you of course have had to have read a lot of classic literature. We have a special section in our school library called Literary Classics, books that have been given special stature because of their literary merit. It's the one genre that often causes debate. For example, what does constitute classic literature? I think there is one thing we can all agree on though. Whilst all written by eminent authors, they tend to all be challenging reads. When Emily mentioned that she tried reading Jane Eyre at the age of 14 and abandoned it, I could totally resonate. I remember as a high school student slogging through many of these books, either as assignments or answering questions on exams. Grades depended on a deep understanding of them. Quite clearly, these kinds of books are brilliant. It's just at the time, I couldn't understand them. We often feel that the pinnacle of building a reading life is reading or rereading the classics. In fact, many authors I have chatted with on this podcast have seen it as a moral imperative to devote time to reconnecting with classic literature, sometimes with mixed success. It's important that as readers that we develop our own tastes, and as Emily tells us, reading for pleasure is top of the list. Sometimes we may feel that the popular culture books we are reading are not worthy of the same literary prominence, or that books such as graphic novels or those that are heavily laden with illustrations are for lazy readers. When we're building our own reading lives, we're going to encounter books we don't enjoy, or that are too hard, and that's okay. We don't have to read them just because other people loved them. Emily said that for her it was all about timing. She returned to Jane Eyre when she was older, and absolutely loved it. For whatever reason, if you've tried and failed with the classics as I did as a teenager, maybe it's time to try again. As Italo Calvino says in his book, Why Read the Classics? A classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say. Maybe you'll discover something new when you reconnect with an old classic. I hope you enjoyed this episode with our reader-in-residence Emily Gale as much as I did. In our next episode, we hear from an author who tells stories for the page and screen. So make sure you subscribe to our podcast on the Ozcast network to find out who it is.
Writers Read by LiTracey. Getting that book in children's hands. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram @Writers Read by LiTracey, a Dave and the Beanstalk production.